All right, we're gonna give it maybe like 3 to 5 more minutes for some more people to join, and then we'll get started. But thank you everyone for joining us this evening. All right, we'll give it like 1 more minute for some more people to join, and then we can go ahead and get started. All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here today for our first Fire Ecology webinar of 2026. My name is Mary Reyes. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Ventura County Resource Conservation District. Today we have a super awesome presentation from Dr. Marko Spasojevic from the Ventura or from University of California, Riverside in the Department of Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology. So thank you, Dr. Spasojevic, for being here today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, thanks. I'm really happy to be here to talk about some of the research we're doing on our forests here in Southern California. And so, let me get my slides going. While we don't have as much forest as they do up in Northern California. Our forests are still a really amazing place and play an important role in regulating our water and storing carbon and in supporting wildlife. And they're also highly impacted by fires, as is sort of all of our ecosystems down here in Southern California. But there's some kind of unique spots in our forests. And so what I'm showing you here is the Calfire fire history map for Southern California. And all of these sort of dark green blobs are all fires, and this goes back to the 1800s. But you can see these light green blobs where there's been no fire for a very long time, right? So and these are a lot of our high elevation forests that haven't burned since sometime in the 1800s. And tonight I want to tell you about one particular spot, Mount San Jacinto. So Mount San Jacinto is the second tallest peak in Southern California. It rises to 10,831 feet. And it's a really cool place if you've never been down there. It's just east of Riverside, just west of Palm Springs, and has this sort of mixed oak conifer forest transitioning to a mixed conifer forest at around 8,000 feet. I like this drawing here that was done a few years back showing sort of our chaparral down here at about 4,000 feet, that mixed oak conifer as we move up. Then we move up into sugar, Jeffrey, ponderosa pine, up to lodgepole, white, and limber pine up at the top. And we can pinyon juniper down here on the desert side as well. So it's a really cool place, but these place hasn't burned in well over 180 years. And that's well outside of how frequently it should burn. And so there's this great study done back in 2008, dendrochronology study looking at the fire history of the area, looking based on tree cores. And so this was done not too far from where we're doing our research. And they found that on average, the normal fire return interval for this place should be about 32 years. So there should be a fire there about every 32 years. And you can see here these fires here, these black bars. The resolution gets a little worse the further we get back because we have fewer old samples. And then you can see where the fire suppression really kicks in here in the early 1900s. Right? There's just no more fire. And so the research question we want to ask is how is this fire suppressed forest changing and what's going on with it? And I really like this comic strip from XKCD that sort of describes our experimental approach. So there's three kinds of research. One is we applied standard theory to novel circumstances and got some surprising results. The second is we applied novel theory to standard circumstances and got some intriguing results. And then the third guy is finally a map of every tree. And that's basically what we kind of set out to do. Not every tree, that would be way too much work, but we set up what's called a forest dynamics plot up here on Mount San Jacinto. So here we are, Southern California in Riverside County. Here's Riverside, Palm Springs. Here's Mount San Jacinto, Mount San Gorgonio on the other side of the pass here. And about halfway up at about 5,000 feet, we set up our forest dynamics plot. And here's what this forest looks like. Nice sort of pine oak forest. You can see a lot of fuel on the landscape here. And back in 2018 and 2019, we went through and mapped 4 hectares. So it's a 200 meter by 200 meter area, basically 2 football fields by 2 football fields in length. And every single tree bigger than 1 centimeter in diameter, so about the size of my finger, we mapped, marked, measured, and tagged. So that was 17,000 total stems and about 4,600 main stems. And what this map here is showing is the distribution of those main stems. So sometimes a tree has 3 or 4 stems, and we just map the main one here, the biggest one. So we have 18 species in this forest. The blues are the oaks. You can see a lot of Quercus wilsonii up in this corner, some Calogii and Chrysolepis in the blues. The conifers are in green. We have 4 pines, Jeffrey, ponderosa, sugar, and coulter, and then white fir and incense cedar, a handful of manzanitas here that are in that kind of lavender color, and a handful of other shrubs that are, you can see some rhododendron here, and then there's some other ceanothus and other odds and ends floating around. And so we went through and mapped this whole forest back in 2019 to get an idea of what's going on in this forest. And this is the size distribution of those trees back in 2019. So each species here on the x-axis and their diameter at breast height in 2019 on the y-axis. So there's a couple things to note here. First, we have some big trees, over 100 centimeters in diameter. These are big trees. You need 2 or 3 people to go around. Mostly pines, one cedar here and a couple of our black oaks. Then also our manzanitas are enormous. So a 20 centimeter diameter manzanita is about this big around. This place hasn't burned in such a long time that some of our manzanitas actually look like trees, and they're really big. So as I mentioned, we went through and we mapped this whole thing, and then we subdivided it into these 20 by 20 meter quadrats. So this orange box here. And within the central 64, we set up 256 1 meter seedling plots. So here we censused every single tree under 1 meter and then tagged them. And we've been following these now for 4 years. And the first thing we want to do is just compare, what's the difference between the adults and the seedlings to get an idea of how this forest might be changing. So what I'm showing here, this is what's called a non-metric multidimensional scaling plot. But basically each point here is one of those quadrats. The adult community is in these gray little circles, and then the seedling community is here in white. And we can see that they're kind of in different space, suggesting that they're different. But you can really see it here in this bar chart. So we're showing here is the relative abundance of our adults and our seedlings. You can see here that the oaks make up about 45% of the adult plant trees. The pines here make up about another 20%. And we have our cedar, our manzanitas, and our fir. But if we look at our seedlings, our babies, 75% of that is oaks. The pines, all 4 species, are basically about as wide as that little laser pointer is. There's almost no pine recruitment in this forest. And our cedars are doing actually quite well, and then we're having a handful of firs, right? And so this is pretty consistent with what you'd expect for a fire suppressed forest. Pines generally need bare mineral soil to germinate. And this is the leaf litter there from black oak, Quercus callagii. I can see it's over my ankles there. And so without a fire to come through and clear this out regularly, we're never going to have these pines really have a good space to germinate. These can't get through this leaf litter. We also see a high abundance of shade-tolerant seedlings. So pines, again, like open, like sunlight, but incense cedar and white fir are very shade-tolerant and really like these shady environments. And here you can see a whole bunch. These are all baby cedars here that are growing these like nurseries of baby cedars in these shady areas that are doing just great, and really no pines recruiting. And again, lots of oaks, especially black oak, coming in really well. And after 4 years of surveys, we found 3 pine seedlings total across all 4 species. So we're seeing very, very little recruitment. And one possibility is that we're just waiting for a mast year. And so trees mast means they kind of wait to reproduce when it's a good year, and then they just make tons and tons of seeds and wait another 4 or 5 years for another year. My grad student Sophie is currently working on this. So this is our same map here of our forest plot. These black squares are our seedling plots. And in the center of every group of 4, we have these seed traps. And so what we're doing with these is a very high-tech equipment where we have a laundry basket with window screen and chicken wire on it. But by having it at a known location and all our trees mapped, we can see what seeds fall into this, mostly our acorns and our manzanita berries. And we know how far away that adult tree is, or what's the abundance of those trees around it to get an idea of how much seed dispersal there is. She's also doing cone counts. These are way too small for our big, culture and sugar pine cones. So she's been doing cone counts as well over the last summer, and has found really, really few cones. And the cones she does find are mostly getting eaten by squirrels. So even if there is cones coming out, they're not making it into this sort of reproductive class. And so to really answer this question of how the forest is changing, what we went through and actually did was go through and re-measure every single one of those stems over the last 2 years. So we're making another map of every tree. So we're actually going to wrap this up now. We've done all the measurements of growth and adult mortality. And our new saplings, we have about 10% of our plot left to do. Those trees that were now 1 centimeter in diameter that weren't previously. And so over the last 2 summers, I had a great group of undergrads and grad students working on this to remeasure every single one of those stems, which is, you can imagine, was an awful lot of work. And so we found over these 6 years that mortality was highest in the shrubs. So out of those 4,600 main stems, we had 295 die, so about 6%. And from the 7 shrub species, that mortality ranged between 10 and 60%. It was much lower in our trees, between about 2 and 10%. What I'm showing here is the DBH of those trees that died. And so were they big trees or small trees, basically? So this is the diameter and breast height of 2019, and every one of these points is a tree that died. So we can see a few things here. First, our shrubs. We had a kind of large amount of manzanita death. We lost a couple of our big ones here and lost a fair number of our shrubs. Then looking at our trees here, most of our oak mortality for Quercus chrysolepis and Wislezenii was actually in these much smaller trees, where in black oak, Quercus kilogii, we actually lost mostly big trees. And this is something we've been seeing in the area, is sort of these getting a lot of oak seedlings, but they don't seem to be recruiting terribly, that making it to be adults, and the adults are dying. We lost one of our big trees, unfortunately. So we had about 6 that were over 100 centimeters in diameter. And this is one of our coulter pines that fell. Um, we've started doing a postmortem to try to understand what's killing these trees. And we haven't seen much beetle activity up there. So we don't think this is really caused by a gold-spotted oak borer or anything like that. It seems a lot to be windfall. That when a lot of these big trees fall, they kind of take out a lot of the smaller trees as well. And so that was our death. Here's our recruitment. And so between 2019 and 2025, we added 442 stems that moved from that seedling to sapling class. So these are things that are now larger than 1 centimeter in diameter. And our highest recruitment was in our fir and cedar, our sugar pine, and our oaks. And we had almost no shrub recruitment. So here we are again with our species on the x-axis and our number of new saplings. And you can see here, incense cedar really took off. We had, about 160 new recruits, a fair number of white fir, some sugar pine, and then Quercus Wislezenii and Chrysolepis did pretty well as well. But not a single new Jeffrey pine or ponderosa pine, and very few black oaks. And then a lot of our shrubs showed absolutely no recruitment. And so here, this next slide is showing that net change. So sort of, births minus deaths, or the recruits minus what we lost. So if it's below 0, we had a net decrease in number of stems. And if it's a positive, we had a net increase. You can see for some of our shrubs, we lost a lot of individuals, especially our Lonicera here. We lost over 50. We lost a lot of our manzanitas. Our pines aren't doing terribly great. Sugar pine are doing pretty well. And then our cedar and fir are doing really well as well. And then finally, we have our growth. We found growth was highest in our shade-tolerant trees. So that's our white fir here and our incense cedar. And then our pines, which are softer woods, followed by our oaks, which are harder woods, and then a little bit of growth here in our shrubs as well. And I want to focus in for a minute on 2 species, ponderosa pine and black oak. We have something really cool on these that are called dendrometers. And these are sort of like a Fitbit or an Apple Watch for a tree. And so this is the dendrometer here that we put on the tree, and then we wrap this metal band around it. And what it does is it measures how much the tree shrinks and swells every 15 minutes. And so as a tree closes its stomata at night, as it stops photosynthesizing, it swells a little bit as it takes up water. And then as it opens its stomata and starts transpiring, doing photosynthesis, it shrinks a little bit. So it kind of does this every day. So you can see these daily fluctuations here as these little fine scale bumps in the tree. And then we can see here it rained. And so the tree took up a whole bunch of water. And then it started drying off and the tree lost some of that water. And then eventually we get to a point where these daily fluctuations sort of surpass those peaks. That's where we get our growth. And so this really allows us to ask questions about how the weather affects the growth of these trees at a really, really fine scale. So we had these dendrometers on for 2 years through 2022 and 2023. 2022 was a pretty dry year. 2023 was much wetter. So we have sort of a drought and a more normal year here. These gray boxes show the times we analyzed just to keep our sample sizes consistent between the 2 years. And so it's really interesting. During the drought, ponderosa pine grew a lot more than black oak. So what I'm showing you here is ponderosa pine in this greenish and black oak here in this orange color. We have the total radial growth, so how many millimeters it grew, and then how many days it grew. And you can see during this drought, the black oak basically shut down and stopped growing. There's a couple individuals that did a little stuff, but by and large, a lot of these oaks were just not growing at all, whereas the pines continued growing. In 2023, when it was much wetter, we saw, the oaks pick back up and showed similar amounts of growth as the pines. Then we can look at the sort of the total over that entire period where the pines grew a bit more over the whole 2 years versus those oaks. And because we have this whole thing mapped, what we can do that's sort of interesting is take an individual tree here. This is one of our black oaks with a dendrometer. Then look at the neighborhood around it and ask, how does this tree grow with different neighbors? And is it better to have more neighbors or fewer neighbors? Often we think that, in these fire suppressed forests, they get really dense. That might create a lot of competition where trees are competing for resources like water. And so we did that for all of our trees. We have 10 of the ponderosa and 10 of the black oaks. And it wasn't quite what we expected, that there'd be greater competition with these, more crowding. And so what I'm showing here on the x-axis is the total basal area of the trees in that neighborhood. So basically how much area of tree, how much tree is in that neighborhood. You can see it varies a lot between the oaks and the pines. But we can see here, these dashed lines here are significant relationships, where in general, we had more days of growth when we had more neighbors around those trees. These here are both not significant relationships. So they didn't matter how much they grew, but they had more days of growth. And then when we looked at the composition of the neighborhood, so these are conspecifics. So these are members of the same species. So having more neighbors of the same species, so if you're a pine growing around more pines, didn't really influence your growth at all or the number of days that you grew. But having heterospecific species, so these are trees that are different species. So if you're an oak surrounded by pines or a pine surrounded by oaks, you actually grew more by having more different neighbors around you. So I think there's some sort of facilitative effect here that these different trees growing together in sort of mixed neighborhoods actually do better than they do in sort of a monoculture. And so to wrap up this section, both species differ in their seasonality of growth and how they respond to low water availability in Southern California montane forests. And it suggests that there might be some tree facilitation playing a role in increasing the total growth and increasing the probability of growth, but maybe not the growth rate. And so overall, we found that the changes we're seeing are sort of consistent with what we'd expect for a fire suppressed forest. Our firs and cedars thrive in high shade environments when there's no fire. We're seeing the highest survival and recruitment of these species and the greatest growth. And the pines won't really recruit well without bringing back fire to this forest. But because we haven't had fires in such a long time, you can see this really nice fire ladder here. These really young cedars growing right up into that pine canopy. So if we do get a fire, it's not going to be a nice ground fire. It's going to be sort of a catastrophic, crown fire that really has a big effect on these forests. I think really what we need to do is probably some thinning and some prescribed burns to really get these forests back to be able to be healthy and get back to that 32-year fire return interval. I think without some of these management techniques, we're going to end up with sort of these catastrophic fires. And our plot is about, 10 kilometers, maybe 6 miles away from Idlewild, which was evacuated back in 2018 when the Cranston fire came through. And so there's a lot of people living up in the mountains. Without some management, I think we're going to have some really bad fires up there. And to finish up, I just want to focus on a couple other research initiatives we have up in the forest. So on top of these band dendrometers up here, we just started working with a startup in the Bay Area for these point dendrometers. And we also have tensiometers. So tensiometers are things we actually embed inside the tree, and it allows us to look how stressed the tree is in real time. These point dendrometers are much cheaper than these bands and allow us to basically look at the same thing, except they measure every 5 minutes at the micron scale. So really fine scale changes and when they're uptaking water and things like that. And so we have 100 of those now across our entire plot. And so each one of these diamonds represents one of those point dendrometers. And we have them on 10 species now. These have been going for about 2 years and should give us a better idea of the spatial variation in this growth and how these neighborhoods are affecting different species beyond just ponderosa pine and black oak. We've started looking at tree cores as well to look at sort of long-term growth dynamics. And then we have camera traps up as well to look at sort of the wildlife usage within this forest. So we've had these camera traps running for 3 years now and have got all sorts of great stuff like bears and mountain lions, bobcats, foxes, striped skunk, spotted skunk, lots of squirrels and deer, and a fair number of odds and ends of birds. Um, yeah, with that, I'd like to thank the many people that helped on this research, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Spasojevic. That was a super awesome presentation. We definitely have time for questions. So if anyone has any questions, you can put one in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Looks like we have a question in the chat. And the question is, was there ever tree logging in the area? And have you gotten ring-tailed cats in your camera? And
Yeah,
are you using AI to sort through your
yep.
photos?
Um, there was logging, and but it's been a long time. So it was logged in the early 1900s. And so it's a pretty even age stand forest. We have a lot of them are pretty like we have some new recruits and a few old trees that got left behind by the loggers. I'm not really sure why, but yeah, it definitely was logged. We have not gotten a ring-tailed cat yet. I've been hoping to get it, but we have not. We are using an AI to help sort through the photos. The Nature Conservancy has a new program called Anna ML, so Animal. It's a machine learning algorithm for sorting the cameras. We're doing both photos and videos, and so that works pretty well for the photos. But we have a army of 5 undergrads that watch all the videos of all our squirrels and deer and all our animals that we've been using to help identify everything and all the things.
Hi, this is Yvette. So, are there any records of ring-tailed cat in the area? Just
There are, I mean, they're on the in the area, but nobody has seen any in a long time. So I don't know when the last observation was.
interesting.
Our cameras are in a pretty small area. Like I said, it's 4 hectares. We've had them running for
Mm.
3 years, and it took us 2 years to see our first spotted skunk, and we've only seen one coyote the entire time in those entire 3 years now. And so I don't know if it's just not the right habitat or if just that forest is getting too dense. I'm also a plant ecologist, and so this wildlife stuff is all very new to me. So I'm not an expert on ringtail cats by any way, shape, or form.
And with the logging in the 1900s, was there any records of them replanting stuff, or was it just kind of like they took trees for a bit and then never came back?
That's a good question. I haven't seen any records of them replanting, and it doesn't seem like there's any rhyme or reason to like it isn't clear that they replanted particular species or in a particular order. It seems like a
Hmm.
very sort of natural forest. So they may have left some stuff and just kind of relied on natural recruitment.
Hmm.
And I think that's part of why a lot of the pine, like at least Jeffrey and Ponderosa, really aren't recruiting it at all. We have some sugar and coulter coming in,
Hmm.
but we're also at the lower end of their elevation range. And we might also be seeing that sort of escalator to extinction where with climate change, the climate's just getting kind of out of sync for these low elevation pines.
Awesome. We have another question in the chat. The question is, what do you actually propose be the next recommended steps for this forest?
I mean, if it was up to me, and I'm not a forest manager, I think it needs to be burned. Um, we're right adjacent to one of the UC's natural reserves, and they've been working with the Kahia people to see if they can do sort of an indigenous burn in the area, and we're hoping that they can come up and do our area as well. But I think it'd be great to actually reintroduce fire to the system. And from a scientific point of view, it'd be fantastic because we've tagged all these trees, and so if we have it burned, we can actually get really good idea of how these forests would recover from a fire because we have such sort of high resolution spatial data on every single stem. Next question, is prescribed fire in that forest possible? And if you have to clear the understory, what species would you prioritize clearing and keeping? That's a good question that I'm not sure I'm the best. It's Forest Service land. I think that's a call they would have to make. There is not a lot of herbaceous understory. There's a fair number of manzanitas there. I think what would probably make the most sense would be clearing out some of those cedars and firs that are smaller, that are kind of making the fire ladders that would create sort of the canopy fires. And it's mostly cedars and firs, and some oak, but not to the same degree.
Awesome. Do we have any more questions?
I have a question. This is Joanna. Sorry, I'm driving, but I wanted to ask more about the hetero specific competition dynamics and the
Mm-hmm.
second part that you talked about. And so you're thinking there may be some facilitation or like, and you showed that picture also of the seedlings kind of germinating under trees. Can you just talk more about that dynamic between the species?
Yeah. So we're working with a ecophysiologist to try to better understand the mechanism. We can kind of guess based on our patterns, but it's a bit of a guess. Um, what we think might be happening is partially maybe some hydraulic lift where these species with different rooting depths might be
Mm,
accessing, pulling up water. I think that also might be just ameliorating the microclimate. If you have, some oaks and some other
mhm.
things around you, creating some shade, it seems to be, might be making it a little bit cooler. And then, but not as competing, as much for the same resources as it would be if it was a member of the same species.
Right. Yeah. Cool.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Are there species or habitats that are particularly vulnerable? I mean, it seems based on what we're finding so far, our Jeffrey ponderosa pine are doing pretty poorly, and the black oak aren't doing great. And so those are the three that I think, I'm most concerned about. But, they're all pretty widespread. We don't have, I think I mentioned, we don't have gold spotted oak borer in the area yet. So by and large, the species are doing, okay. I think at higher elevations, the pines are doing probably pretty okay. I have a new grad student starting this fall who's going to start working her way up the mountain, up to higher elevations to do some dendrochronology to get a better idea how the growth changes as we sort of move up away from this sort of lower elevation range. Um, and within as far as habitats, I think it's mostly the creeks that are not in our forest plot. And so there's a nice creek nearby. We didn't include it in our study because it's critical habitat for mountain yellow-legged frog, and the permitting to get to work in there would have been sort of a nightmare. And so adjacent to that, there's a lot of cedars and a lot of trees that I think seem to be doing okay for now, but it kind of depends on the water. But I think that sort of riparian habitat is probably the most critical up there. How did I pick this plot? Largely access. So like I mentioned, we're adjacent to UCR's James Reserve, and so it's one of the UC's natural reserves where they have cabins and Wi-Fi and a climate station. And so we were actually, our footprint's too big to fit on the reserve, and so we found a spot right off the reserve and worked with the Forest Service to pick the location and get the permissions. And so it was partially convenience. And also I just really like the forests up there. I grew up near Seattle and I spent a lot of my younger days hiking up in forests. And so it was nice to go up and see some forests up there. What about wildlife impacted? Can you elaborate maybe? I mean, um, there's lots of deer. They seem to be doing just fine. There's hunting up there, but we don't see a lot of hunters on our camera traps. We get maybe 3 or 5 a year. So the deer seem to be doing great. Squirrels, acorn woodpeckers, Steller's jays seem to be doing fine. There's plenty of acorns for them to eat. Um, and the mountain lion we've seen up there, seems to be pretty healthy. We've gotten some video of them, with a pretty full belly and seems pretty happy. We have one bear we've noticed up there that seems to be doing pretty well. So we haven't noticed anything bad. I mean, the flying squirrel hasn't been seen there in a while, so we think it's locally extinct. And we haven't seen any ringtails. But everything else seems, from my plant ecology perspective, to be doing not too bad.
Awesome. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? All right. It looks like that's it. Dr. Spasojevic, thank you so much for joining us this evening and telling us about your research. It was really great information. I recorded this webinar and I'll put it up on the VCRCD YouTube channel. And then I will also send it to you, Dr. Spasojevic, through email. But
Yeah.
thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thank you all for joining. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Marco.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.